Good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming to RAG this evening here in London. We are welcoming back Helen N'Day, who is a US-based Cameroon scholar. And Helen gave us a wonderful talk last year at RAG on riddles in African oral traditions. Tonight, she's doing a special talk on the things she knew, the civilizing influence of women in African mythology and folklore. I just wanted to say that I came across Helen's work through the extraordinary work she does on social media, especially the Twitter threads, which are mythological Africans. And this is just a model of how to do Twitter feeds, how to educate using Helen's practice as a model for trying to make interesting Twitter feeds. She's just absolutely splendid. And when it comes to, there's really no end to her talents, because when I ask her to give me an illustration for the RAG talks, she sends me original paintings that she's produced herself as illustrations. So she's a woman of very many talents, and we're greatly looking forward to this talk. I'm going to be putting on the slides, so Helen's going to direct me for that. So bear with us. Helen, please.
All right, thank you, Camilla. And it's always such a treat to be back with everybody here at RAG. Just make sure everybody can hear me clearly, because sometimes I'm a little soft-spoken.
That's fine.
Okay, so everyone can hear me? Cool, cool. All right, so thank you all again for making time to join this session. Thank you to Camilla and Chris and everyone at RAG for giving me the opportunity to join you and talk. And especially giving this talk at this point in, human civilization, with everything going on. And yesterday for us here in the US, hearing the news that the Supreme Court is, taking a stab at abortion rights, which, just cuts at the core of what it means to be a woman and what liberties you can have as you move through the world. I think, and I'm hoping that this talk will serve as a reminder that only half of the human story is being told if it doesn't include the stories of women and how women have influenced human progress over time, and going beyond women to everybody who, those of us who are more on the center of things, at the forefront of things, the people who we push to the margins, just serving as a reminder that we all have a role to play in how we move through this world, and it takes concerted effort to remind ourselves of that. So we'll be talking about the civilizing influence of women in African mythology and folklore. And what I'm hoping for this session to be is not so much a lecture, but a storytelling session where we'll discover these wonderful figures from myth, from folklore, and some from history, through whose actions, knowledge and progress was brought to the people who they influenced, the people who they were a part of. So if we move to the next slide, Camilla, we have an outline of what our talk will be today. We'll start by explaining what we mean by civilizing influence, because there's some pressure around, civilization and what it means, especially when in the context of different peoples across the world and notions of superiority in terms of development. So we'll take some time to tease apart what I really mean here by civilizing influence. And then we will look at women in the context of human civilization and some of the wrongs that have been done to that regard, because as we very well know, starting with Eve, women's knowledge, women's influence has not always been treated fairly. And then we'll look at some of Africa's luminary women. So the goddesses, the spirits, the pioneers, regular women in some cases, through whom knowledge and progress was brought through to the people of which they are a part. So starting with defining civilizing influence on the next slide. Moving on, what do we mean by civilizing influence? On the next slide, I have a picture of Great Zimbabwe, which is one of the African continent's great civilizations. But if you start teasing apart what is out there about Great Zimbabwe, you will find stories about the great kings and the armies and all the accomplishments, the buildings and everything that happened, which speaks to what civilization has been thought of in the past, the political organizations, the social strata, the urbanizations, the communication systems. But it also comes with a distinct dominance in the stories of the men, the kings, the soldiers, the traders, the missionaries, and not so much the stories of the women. In the case of Great Zimbabwe and the peoples of Ndebele, the Shona, and the people whose history these constructions are part of, you will hear stories. There she goes. My apologies for my cat. You gotta go wait. You will hear stories about all these great kings, but not so much the stories of the women who surely had an influence in how these societies evolved. So, but then if you look at what really goes on in the background, you will find that women's work, women's ideas really are at the core of the movements, the actions, the developments that move human civilizations forward. So on the next slide, we go a bit into what I mean by civilizing. So this refers to the act of or process of moving from an uninformed or disorganized state to a more informed or organized state. And I really like a piece written by Dr. David Wengrow, who I believe is affiliated with UCL, where he talks about how men stole civilization and the fact that, civilization is, structures, politics and all of that. But then what really brings people together is mutual aid, social cooperation, civic activism, and hospitality. These are the threads that really hold a civilization together. So this is the framework through which we will be looking at these women's actions and their ideas in the African context. On the next slide is a quote from the article Dr. Wengrow wrote, which really, when I read this, I said, this is really what it is. And I'm just going to read it as it is because it's brilliant. It says, without permanent kings, bureaucrats, or standing armies, they fostered, they in this case being, the smaller societies, not the giant civilizations, which dominate so much of the discourse about civilization. They fostered growth of mathematical and calendrical knowledge, advanced metallurgy, the cultivation of olives, vines, date palms, and other plants, the invention of bread and wheat beer, textile technologies which apply to fabrics and basketry, the potter's wheel, stone industry, beadwork, the sail, maritime navigation, and through ties of kinship and commerce, they distributed these invaluable and cherished qualities of true civilization. So what I want to do with this initial slides is to set the tone for what this session will be about. We will see through these stories how women, the role which women played in introducing knowledge related to agriculture, to navigation, to artwork, to just scientific knowledge, meteorology, understanding of how babies come into being, making of beer, the qualities of a true civilization as said here. So women in human civilization, what has the story been? As we've talked about briefly, there's usually this sidelining, especially in the Western context, which most of us are in right now. One of the most dominant stories is the story of Eve and Adam in the garden, and Eve eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil and being, just punished for that. And starting from that through the ages, women who have knowledge being sidetracked, that knowledge appropriated, being killed for it in some instances. But just looking at the evidence that is there, if we move to slide 8, Kamala, women, our work, our concerns, our innovations are really at the core of a more accurate understanding of civilization. And especially so for African women, when we look at it from the understanding that most of human history in the grand scale of things, started on the African continent and then moved outwards, we have to really come to terms with the idea that there is a lot that we think about as a civilization, we take for granted as civilization, which really has to do with the work of and ideas of African women. Moving on to the next slide, Camilla, and then the next, I think, because we went past this one already. So in this slide, we have the Lembombo bone, which is this ancient, I think almost 40,000-year-old artifact that was found in the Lembombo Mountains in Southern Africa. And there's still some confusion about what exactly this bone served, especially since it's broken. But there are 29 notches on this bone. And there are some people who believe that this bone is something that a woman used to track her menstrual, the menstrual period. So whenever I think of this story, keeping in mind that, there are variable theories about it, to me, if we go with the idea that this was indeed something that a woman used to track her period, this speaks to just, this is a beautiful illustration of the fact that even something as simple as counting is something that is intimately tied to women's processes, women's experiences as they move through the world. So what are these stories then? On the next slide, Camilla, Africa's Luminary Women. On the next slide, we'll find that these are goddesses, queens, spirits, and regular women who introduce knowledge related to agriculture, community building, technology, art, trade, and so much more into their communities. And what I will do in the next couple of slides is discuss some of these stories. In some cases, I will simply read the folktale or the myth as it stands. And in others, I'll have little screenshots of which tell these women's stories. So on the next slide, we start with Isis. It's impossible to start a discussion such as this without referencing Isis, primordial goddess of ancient Egypt, who is credited. Her story is a complex one. She rose from a minor deity to one of the major deities. But her story is associated with the introduction of weaving, baking, brewing beer, and healing using occult knowledge, which she primarily gave to women. And starting with the story of Isis, you see this similar thread in the myths and folklore of different African peoples. On the next slide, we have the story of Oshun, a primordial Orisha of the Yoruba people. And Oshun's story is interesting because it strikes at the very core of not even just civilization, but creation as a whole. In the story, Olodumare, the primordial creator being of the Yoruba people, send the Irun Moles, who are the major Orishas, to Earth to create things and make the world come to life. And you had all the big guys, the Oguns and the Shangos and all these people who, thought through power and, sheer force of will, they could bring things into creation. And no matter how hard they tried, it just wouldn't happen. And then they go back to Olodumare to find out, what are we not getting right? And they discover that it is because they didn't include Oshun in things. Oshun of sweet waters, Oshun of gentleness, Oshun of support and cooperation and love. And to me, this speaks to the fact that, this highlights just the story of human civilization. You have the big edifices, the big political theories and everything, but without the other side, without the stories of women and everyone else who get pushed to the margin, it's not a complete picture. And this one story about Oshun really illustrates that for me. But moving on from Oshun, what are the other stories that we have out there? There is a story of the first Efik woman. And the Efik are a people who are found in Nigeria, in southeastern Nigeria, if I remember correctly. And the story goes that Atai, who is the primordial goddess, and Abasi, her husband, the creator of being, created man and womankind and sent them down to earth. Kept them in the heavenly realm with them because they wanted, their devotion and their focus. And then at one point, Abasi had the idea to send these folks down to earth. And Atai said, don't do that, because if you do, their focus will shift away from you. But Abasi decided to do it anyway. And so Atai told him, well, if you do send them to earth, make sure that they are always coming back to you for food and sustenance. And that's the one way to keep their focus on you. But the first man and the first woman go down to earth, and for a while they will come back to Abasi. Every evening he will ring a bell and they will come back to him for food and everything, until the woman said, hey, we could grow plants by ourselves. We could cultivate, grow things for ourselves, and then we don't need to go back to Abasi every single time he rings the bell. So they decide to do that, introducing agriculture into the story. And for that, the tie between Abasi and Atai and the first man and woman was broken, and the human story progressed. Now, this story seems quite similar to the story of Adam and Eve. And what we will find is that through these stories, you will get instances where the woman's action were not, were rewarded with a punishment or a separation from the gods, which is part of the story. But we will have other instances where it was the gods themselves who showed up, either through in person or through agents to provide the women with knowledge through which they could, move their communities forward. The next slide is the story of Nejma, who is a jinniye, a jinn, and her story is told in The Sage of Tanger al-Balia, which is a Moroccan folktale. And I am just going to read this story because it is a beautiful one, and I quite enjoyed it. So in the story is a sage, a man dedicated to wisdom and collecting as much occult knowledge as he could. And he gathers what he can, what knowledge he can, and finally figures out a spell to conjure up a jinn. And the jinn who shows up is this woman called Nejma. And Nejma takes him under her wing and teaches him everything he needs to know about how to summon spirits and which spirits do what, scientific knowledge, how to move things around and all of that. But unfortunately, in the story, the sage is married. But because of his dedication to knowledge and his infatuation with Nejma, he abandons his wife and goes with Nejma because her, what she has to offer is so intoxicating. And eventually he realizes that he is aging, but she is not. She's perpetually young. She's a jinn. And so eventually she has to leave because she has to carry on with whatever it is Jinniyas do in their lives. And so he is left with the knowledge he has acquired. But there is a beautiful twist in the stories that at the end, the wife who he had abandoned shows up, and he's able to reconcile with her, and life continues. And my sincere apologies, I wish I was able to read this story, but so this is one example in which the woman presenting the knowledge is a spirit. And we will see in subsequent examples where it's a not so much a human being or a goddess, but one of the spirits who animate nature. Sometimes they are female spirits, but sometimes they're not women spirits, but they pass their knowledge on to women. On the next slide, we have the story of Ndiese of the woods. And Ndiese is an Emin, Emin are land deities of the Oku people who are found in Cameroon. And Ndiese's story is interesting because she is still active up until this point in time. And I will just bring that up and read it. So this is a story told by Martha Yatai, and she's an Oku woman, a healer, one of the few in the land of Oku, because the interesting thing here is that it is believed that women initially held knowledge and occult knowledge and power, and then through some things that happened, this power was translated or transferred over to men. So the majority of healers and practitioners of occult knowledge amongst the occult people are men, but Martha Yatai is an exception. She's one of the native doctors. And this is her story. She says, when I was a child, I ventured off into the forest accompanied by a dog. I and the dog entered a certain valley where I saw someone, a goddess in human form, all white. She handed me live plants and a raffia bag. When these things were handed to me, only the dog returned home and I remained there. After a week, the goddess brought me out and kept me under an avocado tree. As I was in this valley with the goddess, my people were looking for me everywhere. It was the dog that finally directed the searchers to the tree where I was found. Now, whenever I am to meet the goddess, I start becoming very ill, having a very high fever that makes me lose my reason. That is when I know I am to meet the goddess. When I become sane again, it is when I have got what I needed from her. I see her handing leaves to me, and thereafter, when I am about to treat a new disease, the leaf which was already shown to me will immediately come to my mind, and I will be directed to the leaf, which I will then harvest. So Ndiese of the Woods is the name of this goddess. And she's the guardian of a range of a forest range, just a forest range called Kilum, which is found in the Oku. Oku is people in the northwestern region of Cameroon. So there's a story, and this theme of women falling under some kind of affliction and encountering a powerful female spirit who gives them knowledge is one that will show up again later in the discussion, because it is the case for another Cameroonian people. In the next slide, we have the story of Ngalo. And Ngalo is a mermaid of the Ndowe people in Equatorial Guinea. And in Ndowe cosmology and their history, they were one of the peoples who migrated from Egypt and southern Egypt, that migration of peoples into the western part of Africa. And they couldn't have accomplished this without the help of Ngalo and other sea spirit, water spirits, river spirits, who showed them how to move down the rivers towards the West African coast. And so in Ndowe folklore, Ngalo is one of the spirits who can be summoned, usually by, I think it's like casting some kind of lot, which calls her forth, and she can provide people with knowledge and support. So an example of a female spirit which facilitated navigation for people as they moved around. In the next slide, we have the story of Asi, who is a seer in some cases, or a goddess of the Foya Kamara people in Sierra Leone. And it is through Asi that the knowledge of indigo dyeing was brought to the people. And if you are familiar with the story of indigo dyeing, it was a massive industry across the West African region. And Asi's story is found in a book I love dearly, Sensuous Knowledge, by Mina Salami. And I'm just going to read the story as it is here. According to the ancient myths, Goddess Asi of the Foya Kamara yearned to possess the blue color of the sky, the lakes, and the birds of paradise, whose feathers were dyed so brightly blue, she had to squint to look at them. One day, despite the consequences of using her powers for personal yearnings, Asi prepared a ritual so that the spirits would grant her the sublime color that occupied her thoughts. She tucked her newborn baby into a white lapa, strapped her around her back, and walked down to the banks of the river Niger to prepare a fire. Once the flame danced, Asi took off the lapa and laid her daughter some distance away from the heat. She then began the ritual, chanting and dancing in the shape of the flames. Eventually, the fire stilled down, and so did Asi. When all that remained were ashes, Asi rubbed her body with the dust. She knew that her request was received. All she needed to do was wait for the color blue to appear to her in some special manner. She decided to return the next day. as he went to pick up her baby, but the lapa she had been ensconced was empty. All that remained under the rectangular piece of white cloth was the pillow of leaves she had gathered from the vines to cushion the child. As he let out a long wail, realizing at once that the gods had punished her for the ritual by taking her baby away. She held the leaves against her chest and sobbed feverishly, which covered her body in a mix of ashes, leaves, and salty tears. Once she began to awaken to reality, as he wiped the murky liquid off her body with the lapa cloth, it was then that she saw a deep blue stain appear on the fabric. That was how Acid discovered that when you mix indigo leaves with salt, liquid, and ashes, it produces the color blue. But she had paid a heavy price for the discovery. Please give me back my baby, she screamed, and the spirits responded. You will conceive a different baby with the same soul, but on one condition. You may only share the knowledge of how to extract the color blue from the indigo plant with women. So we'll move on to the pioneers. So these women are not so much goddesses or spirits, or entities. These are actual human women whose actions or whose connection with goddesses or spirits brought knowledge to human beings. And we'll start with the story of the primordial Soto woman, who this story is the one that triggered this idea in my mind to begin with, because I did a thread on mythological Africans about bread. The theme of the day was bread. And I kept thinking, bread, being West African, bread is not part of the traditional cuisine. So what myths could possibly exist about bread, in the African context, away from, the northern part of the country? And then I had this wonderful discovery that bread baking is actually a practice amongst the Soto people in Southern Africa, and there are traditional techniques that are used to bake sorghum bread. And then I found this story. And this story is about the myth about the origin of marriage, and I'll read that here. So long ago, there were 4 young men who always hunted together. There was no one else on earth, or so they thought. But one day, God created woman and taught her to speak, to bake bread, to make clay pots, to grow grain, and cook it. Thus, one fine day, the 4 brothers met this young woman and wondered if she was a human being or an animal. And one of them said he liked her and withheld his brothers from treating her as gay. The 3 brothers went away, saying they were only interested in hunting, and that if he wanted that strange animal all to himself, he was welcome to it. They were never seen again because after years of hunting, they were caught by lions and died in the wilderness when they were too old to look after themselves or defend themselves. Their woman-loving brother, though, stayed with the woman who lived in a cave near a well in the rocks. She possessed fire, so she cooked his meat for him and gave him some porridge and boiled vegetables, which she had cultivated herself. The man was very happy and better fed than ever. They had many children, and in the end, even grandchildren who looked after the old people. And I love this story because it really strikes at the heart of what it is that makes a civilization. Care, cooperation, civic action, people looking out for each other. And it struck me because you had the situation where, the God creator being gave knowledge to the woman, knowledge about language, about baking bread, growing grain, basically the building blocks of civilization, making clay pots. And, this one man, this very one smart man made the very smart choice to stick with the woman, and things fared well for him for that case. So one of my favorite stories, honestly, that I've come across so far. The next slide is a story of Mansariko, who is a queen of the Mane. The Mane are precursors of the Mende people who are found in Liberia and Sierra Leone. And if you know anything about the Mende people, one of the major things about them are the powerful men's and women's societies around which their whole community structure is organized. And it is believed that Mansariko is who introduced these ideas, amongst many others, to the Mende people. So Mansariko's story is an interesting one. And make sure that I have it here. Okay. I'm just going to read the excerpt from Sylvia Arden-Boone's book about the Mende. And it says there are two histories of the Sande society, one factual and one mythic. The breakup of the Mali Empire occasioned many migrations to the Guinea coast and then into the hinterlands of what is now Sierra Leone and Liberia under the leadership of the warrior queen, Mansariko. There is strong evidence that Mali women brought with them developed powers of rulership based on knowledge of statecraft, herbal medicine, agriculture, and the fine arts. The basis of Mali female education and organization seems to have been a hierarchical initiation society. As the fusing of the Mani invaders with the indigenous people gave rise to the Mende ethnic group, so the Mani sororities led directly to today's Sande society. According to myth, however, the Sande society was an inspiration from the spirit world presented in a dream to one woman who had the conviction and the confidence to wield her community women into a strong sisterhood. The myth gives Sande its supernatural base and allies it with powers, forces, and ideals and concepts, all the workings of the intellect and metaphysical imaginations. And as we now may know, the Sande society is really a strong force in the lives of Mende women, has been and still is up until now. So again, this is another story that strikes at the heart of what, really brings civilizations together. It's not just great buildings or, great advances in technology. It is the forging of bonds of community that help people to look out for each other, to take care of each other, and to figure out how to problem solve and move forward as communities. The next slide is about the Bokondem, who are priestesses of the Ndem spirit in the Ejagam people in Cameroon. And similar to the Sande society, the Bokondems are mediums whose work primarily has to do with taking care of women, teaching women what they need to know to survive in a society in a male-dominated world. And in the myth, the first Mbokondem fell from the sky from a large boma tree, and she had strange dancing attire and spoke to the awed spectators in a queer language. And later on, she married into the community and taught some of the women her secrets. And parents started to initiate their firstborn daughters into her secret knowledge, and this evolved into the Mbokondem Association, which then became famous and quickly spread to other parts of the Ejagam country. And so this, again, is an illustration of how through inspiration, a woman introduces a way of being into a community which moves them from a disorganized state into a more organized state that fosters progress. And of course, one of the terrible stories of the Mbokondems is that as colonialism progressed, the interest was to shift power away from these powerful women societies into the hands of men. And so they are one of the groups which were highly, highly persecuted and all but eradicated. The next story on the next slide is about Nyanya, and it takes us back to the Oku people who have Ndiese of the woods. But in this case, Nyanya is not a spirit or a goddess. She's an actual human being. And she was the queen of the Ntu people, who are the precursors of the present day Oku people. And I'll read her story as it is here. The early history of the Ntu begins with a woman by the name of Nyanya, who founded the Ntu tribe and also introduced iron technology, and more importantly, the magic medicine that has come to define Oku medicine today. And in oral tradition, she had one son, Ganga, who inherited both kingship, magic medicine, and so shifted this knowledge into the hands of men. And what has been incredibly frustrating for me is that I have not found a whole lot of information about Nyanya. The one reference I've seen to it is in this PhD thesis about Oku occult knowledge carried out by an American ethnographer. And he got this story by interviewing one of the traditional doctors in Oku. So if there's anybody out there who has more information about this, please get in touch, because I have been chomping at the bit to get to more of this woman's story, and I have not found a whole lot of information. The next two stories on the next two slides take us to the Dagar people, who are found in Ghana and Burkina Faso and Ivory Coast, I believe. And what is interesting about the Dagara stories is that they have these beings called Kontombili, who are, you could think about them as fairies, not the best term, but they are forest spirits through whose interactions with people, the majority of what the Dagara people know about life occurred. So in the story of how, and before I even go into the story, if you know anything also about West Africa, the shea fruit is massively important, not only as a food source, but for making shea butter, which is used in just about everything, and is one of the big exports from that part of the world. And knowledge of the shea fruit's utility came through the Dagara people through the actions of a woman. And let me find that story here. So the story is told in the myth of the Bagger, which is a long poem which talks about, you know, the Dagar people's cosmology. And it's told that man and woman, when man and woman first came to Earth, they sat amidst a group of trees and had no house or food. So they slept on stones under the tree. And there they found wood, they found food. How did this happen? One night, the woman said to her husband, "Why do we come to sleep in this tree when there is no food growing here? Look at that shea tree or dawa dawa with its food." And the man said nothing. And so she repeated the question for 3 days. And finally, the man said, "Let's go to the shea tree." So they went there, and you know, the woman took a shea nut and ate it and found it sweet. And so she climbed up and harvested more, and they ate. And then the story continues with, you know, the woman moving around looking for food until eventually they run into a Kontombili, who then teaches them about which other fruits they can eat, which ones they can cultivate, and so much more. But that's not the only story. On the next slide, we have the story of how the Dagara people came to know how to brew beer. And in this story, a woman meets a Kontombili while she was out in the bush hunting for dry wood, and he gives her a calabash full of a foamy liquid. And when she drank it, she was delighted and felt merry and wanted to sing. And so she asked the Kontombili what she was drinking, and he said it was dan, which is made from millet grains. And then he started singing, you know, "I am saying it, but I'm not saying anything," telling her how to make the beer. For 3 days and 2 nights, let the grain soak in water under firm ground. "I'm saying it, but I'm not saying anything." On the 3rd day, bring the wet grain into the air below the sky and let it rest below a blanket of green leaves for another 3 days. "I'm saying it, but I'm not saying anything." Then separate the grains one from the other slowly and let the sun dry them slowly. "I'm saying it, but I'm not saying anything." Pound the dry grains, cook the meal for 2 days and drain. Then take the juice and add some ferment. Let it mix and foam. "I'm saying it, but I'm not saying anything." And when the juice is under a white foaming blanket, enjoy the whole of it. "I said it, but I didn't say anything." And so the woman went home and did as she was told. And since then, the Dagara people have done. The next slide is yet another story from the Dagara people. And it is how a woman discovered the connection between sexual intercourse and reproduction, how babies were made. And the story starts with a woman who bears a child. Well, it starts with the male version of how babies come about. And, you know, the story from the male healer was mix a little earth with plants and a whole lot of things. And from there you have a baby. And of course, an argument arose over to whom the baby belonged. And because the understanding of how babies come about wasn't clear then, the baby chose its father. But then the woman wasn't convinced. So she refused to go with her husband the next time he was going to go to the male, you know, medium to figure out how to get a child. She goes instead into the forest, where she runs into a boa constrictor and its mate in the process of intercourse, and she observes them. And then the boa constrictor, you know, talks to her and helps her figure out exactly what was going on. So she goes home to her husband and tells him, let's play a game. And they play this game and a child comes about. And that is how Dagara people came to, according to their mythology, came to understand how babies come into the world. I thought this one was very interesting, especially with the snake and the symbolism that snakes have throughout most of the African continent and women's fertility rights and all of that. Our final story on the next slide comes from the Dinka people who are found in present-day Sudan. And it's the story of Abuk, the primordial woman who was later elevated to Goddess. Abuk's symbol is also a tiny snake, and she presides over women's activities, especially the cultivation of millet. And in the story goes that Nyalak, who is the primordial creator being of the Dinka, permitted Abuk and her husband Garang to plant and grind just 1 grain of millet a day for food. But one day she felt especially hungry, and so she planted several millet grains, and she used a long-handled hoe to do the planting. And at that time, the earth and the sky were very close. So as she used her hoe to do the planting, she struck Nyalak with her hoe, and this angered the god so much, he cut the rope that existed between earth and the heavens and withdrew his involvement from women's affairs. What's interesting about this story is that, you know, they were, the man and the woman were taught to plant 1 grain at a time, but the woman came in with this hoe, this technology, and was able to cultivate more. And in this case, she was punished for it, or humankind was punished for it. So what's the common thread in all these stories in our conclusion on the next slide? These women are the acquirers. So they, either through just figuring things out or the interaction with spirits and deities, acquire knowledge, which they then share with their communities, in some cases with the injunction from the deity to only share this knowledge with women. So women become the possessors of this knowledge, whether it is knowledge of how to dye, or knowledge of how to brew beer, or knowledge of how to use medicine for magic or bake bread. And more importantly, they become dispensers of this knowledge, which organize their communities into better functioning units and move them forward. And also to emphasize that the outcomes are not always tragic. And I wanted to emphasize this point because the story of Adam and Eve dominates so much of Western and by extension, the rest of the world's consciousness with colonization, which casts the idea of a woman seeking out high knowledge as something which is not a good thing. And for ages, women have suffered for this. But as we see through many of these stories, the outcome is not always tragic. And I am willing to venture a guess that the situations in which the outcomes have been tragic, there was probably a bit of male influence in that story. And so with that, we come to the end of the discussion. Thank you all so much again for the opportunity to talk with you. Mythological Africans is a space I curate where I delve into more and more of these myths. And in the next slide, you can have details on how you can connect with me. The mythologicalafricans.com website is the one-stop shop. From there, you can access the Twitter page where I do most of my work, but also the YouTube channel where I do deep dives into different topics. Recently, we just started diving into the topic of African sexualities. But I also have a newsletter, so you can keep up with news and events as they happen. So thank you all so much once again, and hopefully we have time for some questions.
Great. Thanks, Helen. That's beautiful, comprehensive overview of so many fascinating stories. I think you could get lectures from any one of those traditions and pull out so many themes there. For instance, with the Yoruba story, the Oshun story, something that Rag people will be excited is didn't Oshun go to the moon? Didn't she hide herself in the moon when the gods didn't recognize her? She fled to the moon and refused to come down, so they had to beg her to do that. That's one thing I was remembering. Yeah. There's so many. I love the snake story because it has a similarity with a bit of similarity with Adam and Eve, actually, this knowledge of the snake, I would say, perhaps. Are there people with questions or any ideas for Helen for discussion? Anybody who'd like to come in? Glenn, we can't hear you very well. You've got a question. So there's a question on the chat. I don't think Glenn we can't hear very well. I don't know if anybody else can, which is asking about the Mbokondem and the story of the original Mbokondem. It states in the text on the slide, she married and taught women. So this can be read as though she became married to other women. Is this just unclear language?
That's a very, very interesting question, because traditionally, Mbokondem priestesses they were virgin priestesses. Ideally, that's what they were supposed to be. So I read, but still, I read that text as her marrying into the people. So she married a man from the people. But because she had this advanced knowledge about, medicine and a whole lot of things, people sent their daughters to her to learn. And through that, this society was formed. That is something I will want to look into again, because like I said, it was a requirement that if you were going to be an actual Mbokondem priestess of the Ndem spirit, you couldn't get married, which is one of the tragic things that happened because men in the community wanted access to that power. A lot of these women were then made to marry, and that just destabilized the foundations of this organization. So there were priestesses who were virgin priestesses, expected to refrain from any sexual intercourse. But then there were also initiates into the society who could marry. So I don't know if that answers your question. My reading of that particular sentence is that she married a man in the community because she was not from there. So perhaps as a way to legitimize her presence. But the outcome was that her priestesses, the priestesses of Ndem spirit, were expected to be celibate.
Any more thoughts or questions? Manchego, go for it.
Yes, I knew when you were talking about Ngalo, the mermaid goddess, it tells the story of a westward exodus from Egypt, or something like that. Is what you said. That's what my notes say here, which triggered. I've heard several other stories about West African societies. In fact, somebody, and I can't remember who, mentioned that the hat, which you saw is seen in the Soto primeval woman, or on that Soto woman that you had in your slides. That hat is seen among some peoples in southern Egypt, in some of the paintings on the walls there. Do you have any other examples of this Egyptian connection that you've come across?
Thank you for that question. And the short answer is yes. There is one other people who trace their roots back to Egypt. I believe that, and I'm not speaking as an authority here. These are stories that I have read, and some of them are disputed. But I know that the Bassa people, who are found in Cameroon, Liberia, and other parts of the African continent, also trace their origins back to a migration from out of Egypt. I believe that some Yoruba people believe that they also came out as part of that migration, but I think there's scholarship that disputes that. But I think the one where I've seen some, there's also, I don't know if this is a migration per se, but there is similarity in artwork and philosophical beliefs between some of what the Akan people believe and what some of the beliefs in ancient Egypt. For example, the Akwaba, which is a female fertility figure, has been likened to the Ankh. So I've seen some evidence from the Bassa people in Cameroon and other parts of Africa. Some mention of the Yoruba, although that is disputed, and some discussion about the similarity between the Akwaba of the Akan and the Ankh. But that is as far as I'm willing to say, because that is not something that I have looked at quite a lot. And I think this also falls under the purview of the idea that in a lot of people's origin myths, they will try to link themselves to some powerful group, some historically recognizable group. And that happens on a large scale as well as a small scale. And there are people in this room probably who can speak to that more intelligently than I can. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you very much. Yes, it does. That's a good one.
Thank you. Thank you.
Declare. Unmute. You want to unmute? Great. We can't hear. Can't hear. You got your mic turned off somehow. Try again. Helen, can you hear? No.
I can't, no.
No. Dikla, we can't hear. Can we write in the chat? Oh, we got audio now, baby. No, still can't. No. Can't hear. Can't hear.
Can you read out the chat question if it's there?
It's not there. No, she's talking. Sorry, Dikla, we cannot hear. Oh. Okay, can we say, Dikla, if you can try and sort out your sound or write the question in the chat, would be quite great. Anybody else in the meantime can try and go ahead. Yeah. Anyone else? Ian, come in. We'll wait for a Dikla.
Can't hear. Ian?
Ian?
Yeah.
Can't help. Yeah.
I don't know whether we'll have time for this, but I have a Bushman's story here, an origin story, which obviously takes things further back, and it's a broader conception of civilization. I mean, I'll try and summarize it, but shall I just?
I think we'd like to hear the story, Ian.
Okay.
Read some of it, Ian.
Right. This is, in the very beginning, there were no people on the earth. In the very beginning, there were no people on the earth, but there was one woman. She lived alone. This woman, while she was sitting all alone, was longing to have company. And she was sitting there. There was nothing else on the earth. It was naked. It was nothing, nothing at all. So, while she was sitting all by herself there, alone, she saw a seed. So she thought she'd do something with the seed. She picked up the seed and she thought she would do something with it. She could throw it in, could throw it into the fire. But when it got into the fire, it jumped out again, and it jumped far off. And when it fell on the ground, it became another human being. It turned itself into a human being. So this woman called this human being. His name was Koanska, which is the trickster amongst this particular Bushman group. She said to him, "Look, seed, you've changed yourself into a human being. I want you to do as I tell you. You must become very wise. You must learn how to hunt. You must be a good hunter. I'll send you out to hunt for me." So this man went out, and every time he'd hunt a steenbok, or he'd hunt a duiker, or a hensbok, or a kudu, or a hartebeest. And every time he brought it to her, and she said, "No, it's no good. You must come back and get me another one." So this is how he started to learn to hunt. She taught him very well how to hunt. But every time he brought this meat in, she said, "No, I don't want it. This is not good. The thing that I want, you would find it by knowing its size. It would be big, 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 very, very, very big. It would be so big that the shadow would cover all the sky and all the earth. It would be so big." The hunter went out and he found this very, very big, 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 big thing, and he killed it. But she didn't know the name of this big thing, but it was very big. So the hunter came back to this woman and he said, "I found what you want. I killed it, but it's too big for me to bring it. It's too big for me to carry. Now, what shall I do?" As you became very wise by hunting, I want you to become wise to find a way of bringing the thing. So he made a plan. He went to this big thing and he thought, "I must make a plan to take this thing to this woman." So he couldn't pick it up. The only plan that he could make was to drag it. So he dragged and dragged and dragged, and little by little by little, he dragged and dragged and dragged this thing until he brought it to this woman. Then this woman said to him, "Yes, this is the thing I want. And you were wise to drag it here. You made a plan to get it here. This is what I want." And then they started to cut it. And when they cut it, something came out. They cut it and many animals came out. They cut it and the goats and the cattle and the different people and the trees and all the different people came out for every cut. So the lions, the dogs, the chickens, the birds that sing, just everything came out from this big tree. People and all the things came out to live on the earth. That first woman was called Makweni. Makweni means moon. And the moon is the one that told people to rise up again after death. Because when the moon dies, she wakes up again and comes alive again. This woman was called Makweni. Makweni was the first woman being. And she was taught by the moon to rise up after death. The moon said, no, when a person dies, she doesn't die. He doesn't die for good. I, the moon, who is the one that rises up again after I die. I want the people to live again after they die. So the moon says the person gets sick and ill. To rise up again, he would die, but he would live after this. But after the hair, the person dies forever. So I just thought Helen would like that one.
Yeah. Helen, what do you think? Oh,
I was muted. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I haven't run into that story before. And what I find just fascinating about these stories is just how a lot of the themes circle back to similar ideas. So you have this woman and the seed and the moon and just, yeah, thank you for sharing that. I thoroughly enjoyed that. And I want to know more. I think, and we talk about this quite a bit in RAG Book Club discussions, just how much of the mythology and folklore and ideas of the forest people, the hunter-gathering people, lie at the core of what we consider civilization now, notions of cooperation, notions of figuring out how to do things, how to say things. So yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. I really hadn't heard that story before, so.
It's possible that story is just about as old as the Lembombo bone that you showed us, the Middle Stone Age bone, possibly, Ian. It may be that old, or something like it. Chris, did you want to come in?
Well, just linking the Lembombo bone to everything that Helen said, I mean, there's so much, every single, of course, we all know this, every single one of those stories just reaches out and connects up. There's so many roots and tangled sort of knots connecting everything up. But the Dinka story that you read out, you told us about, Helen, the one about the woman's hoe, that she lifts up the hoe too high and it bumps into the sky and God gets very cross and disappears so that heaven gets separated from earth. That is no question about it. It's a version of the story that Ian read out, a kind of negative version, really, because that, I'm sure you know this, Helen, but all of these stories, it's long versions as well as short ones. But that story is about the origin of death, the Dinka one you read out, because of course the story is that originally there was a rope between earth and sky, and you just went to the world beyond, and you came back. You went to the world beyond, and you kept coming back up and down between this world and the other, this world and the other, until the woman lifts her hoe up too high and angers God, and he moves away, and that snaps the link between earth and sky. And so now the tragedy is that when we die, we stay dead. But women with their menstrual cycle, and that of course links to the Lembombo bone, always knew how to go with the moon. So menstruation is a form of death, a form of illness, and when you menstruate, you kind of die. You bleed, you die, you lose your reason. Maybe that's another theme in the stories. You meet the goddess when you become afflicted. But somehow this situation of being able to go with the moon and keep moving between life and death, earth and sky, one world and the other, got disrupted. And actually it is usually, isn't it? It's usually something to do with agriculture that annoys the moon or separates earth and sky. And so you get these stories about it's all women's fault. They shouldn't have lifted the hoe too high. Now when we die, we stay dead. So these stories just connect up absolutely beautifully. And what's wonderful, Helen, is the way you're dedicating your life to seeing all those connections and regaining a real pride in African identity and mythology through these wonderful myths. So, I mean, all power to you. There's a lot for all of us. There's a lot more. There's a lot further to go. But you've done so much to connect it all up and give meaning to these stories, current political and social, Africanist, feminist, of course, meaning to these stories, all of which are sort of about an original time when women were kind of in touch with the moon and able to inspire men to do things properly in the way that Ian's story told. And then this terrible disaster when men started taking over. And this, the worst of all disasters is of course that when we die, that's it, we're dead. What a tragedy.
Thank you, Chris. I consider it a privilege, really, to be able to get to these stories and make the connections and get the opportunity to share them as widely as I can. And one of the things that really motivates and inspires me is doing a storytelling session, having different people come together and say, hey, we have this story too, and making these connections and like you said, taking some pride again in the stories that we have and figuring out how to be in the world as it is now, being inspired by the stories. So thank you.
Dikla, can you talk now?
Hi, can you hear me?
Great.
Yes, okay. So hi, Helen. Hi, everybody. I've been watching you for a long time from my computer when you on RAG.
Great.
The kinds of the myth that you brought, because I had this feeling that you brought a lot of myths that are already teaching women how to cope with the patriarchy. And I really wanted to know if there are myths that are older, because in my feeling, the myths that we are now revealing are very fresh, very like beginning. And for us, they are very fresh because we are for a long time living under the patriarchy. So maybe I didn't hear all the myths that you brought, but most of them there weren't women creators. Only there were movements that they couldn't create without Ushon and all these. But I was wondering if you met more of these, of the kinds that are women creators.
Thank you for the question. And I'm just going to repeat it to make sure that I understand what you're asking. So what you're saying is in a lot of these stories, they already feature women in some kind of tension with men. And you're wondering if there are any stories which happened before this tension became the thing it is? Is that?
Yes, not only the tension, but you when you have to live with this slight, most of this, what I figure that what I love about hunter-gatherers communities that I've been exposed to lately is this movement between living and waning, and this dance that I feel is dancing every month with this synchrony.
Shame.
Can't.
That sounds fun. Really shame.
Sadly, free. Come back.
It's-
No. Yeah.
The Wi-Fi is rubbish, evidently,
Yeah.
whether it's mine or somebody else's Wi-Fi.
No, it's probably Decla's own.
Not sure.
Probably creative.
We better move on. Yeah,
Can you say anything more, or not sure?
I think we've lost it altogether now.
Yeah, she's jumped out.
You
should
didn't
I
lose me. I'm still here.
Oh,
You
Made it
jumped
back.
back in. Just like dying and living back again. So
Yeah.
what I'm asking is about myth of before, maybe if there were only women in some of the myth, because even in the myth that there are 4 hunters and then the god builds a woman, there is still this Adam and Eve thing that of the maybe the Wawalak sister that even the Aborigines, they have this first the were woman and then they did it like this and then came our ruling of everything, or we took over.
Right.
Do you understand?
Yeah. So I'm thinking through, just doing a quick mental run through the stories I know outside of these. And aside from the one which was just read, there aren't any that are jumping to mind which start with exclusively women only. There are quite a few where men were in their own area and women were in their own area, and then they meet somehow and things start happening. But there are none that I am aware of which start, with a woman-only world, really. And I think my theory is that, well, I have 2 theories around this. One, a lot of these stories that we have, by the time they were collected, the world, including people on the including communities on the African continent, were already, had significant patriarchal influence. So that influenced the stories that were told. But also, in the world views of most African peoples, there is a complementarity between the role men play in society and the role women play in society. And there's an understanding that one is not more important than the other. And I think that in the original stories of African peoples, that is reflected. So yes, women are elevated, as women should be in some cases because of the role they play in reproduction, fostering, the community, which was very, 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 very important thing, being able to have a child. And just for the other goods that feminine energy, as we saw in the Oshun story, brings to, communities. But there was also an understanding that men have their role to play. So there are not likely to be so many stories, if at all, which start, with a distinct domination of women. Now, are there stories which are like mythical, historical stories which feature, communities dominated by women? There are quite a few. But I don't know that in mythology and folklore per se, you will necessarily see, this strong female dominance, because mainly of that complementarity. And this is me theorizing. I have yet to read all the myths and folklore that is out there that have been written about African people. So I am open to learning more, but that's my theory at this point, if that makes any coherent sense.
Yes, it does. I didn't want matriarchy, that women build the world, but I wanted the ones that were just slightly maybe before the shift, or ones that are connecting that hold both. Like you said, both are really important,
Right.
because this is the thing in my view.
Well, perhaps I mean, obviously what the story that Ian read is a really, really old story, which is looking from a perspective of women's power and organization, and referring to hunting the moon and kind of the origins of society as such. But there's also
I was disconnected in this point, so I will hear it in next after.
Yeah, that story. Oh, we need to put that story out now. So maybe Ian can tell that story sometime when he's doing some more hunter-gatherer stuff. But also, if we think about the word civilization, as Helen's been talking about it, now Jerome Lewis, I don't think he's here tonight. I don't think he has logged in, but he speaks very eloquently about forest peoples, hunting and gathering forest peoples as a very long-lasting civilization, you know, one of the oldest civilizations on Earth. And as Helen says, their stories of kind of the emergence of human society is one with men in one place, women in another place, and women are the ones who hold the spirit known as Ejengi or Jengi, and they have babies through the actions of this spirit until men find and discover that these women exist. And then men go through a pretend motions of hunting and hunt the women, chasing them with parcels of honey, because until that time, men had only been able to have sex with these very uncomfortable mapombe fruit. But by hunting the women with the parcels, the women decide that maybe the men aren't so horrible, they can get together and they have a lovely time. But what the men do is they take Ejengi from the women to make sure that the women come to them to have sex and have babies. So we get this story with many hunter-gatherer groups, although it's not so much in the Bushmen, that women originally had the spirit. They originally had Molimo, they originally had Epeme, they originally had Ejengi. So we get that story. And Helen was mentioning it too, that there are rituals and secret societies that have passed from women to man, I think you were saying.
And in addition to that, there is also the story amongst the Opu people about how Nyanya was the one who had, you know, technological knowledge and magic knowledge. And then it got passed through her son to men, to the point now where in Opu society, it's almost taboo for women to hold, you know, certain kinds of power, except for the one exception we saw, where she derives her knowledge directly from the goddess. So yeah. That's something that I am finding very fascinating too. So these stories of the transfer of power, of knowledge from men to women, and something I think I'll probably in the future dedicate some time to investigating, finding stories like that from different parts of the continent.
Just to say, Helen, in my own book, Blood Relations, I have a whole chapter with a whole bunch of those stories, and the stories seem to be about the fact that the initial political power came from women because they could connect up with each other thanks to having menstrual cycles, and men were very sort of jealous of that potential through the moon being able to connect up in that way. And of course these are patriarchal myths, and they depict the sort of rule of women as this terrible tyranny of women against men, and then men had to. I mean, these are all over the world. In fact, they're particularly powerful, these stories, where just in those places where men have a very powerful one-sided monopoly over ritual power. So many parts of Amazonia and Papua New Guinea and those parts of Africa where you've got quite tyrannical male dominance. Just about, I think, invariably, the men have a secret, which is that all the power which they wield was stolen from women. And but I was just going to ask you, Helen.
Dogon. An example would be Dogon mythology.
Right. Yeah, but I was going to ask you a question. Have you any more stories about what's often called ignorance of paternity? Your story from the Bagre was about how women in linking up with a snake, were able to sort of get a lesson and find out sort of where babies come from. But that seems to me a really interesting motif about, and of course in the West, it's too often this thing about the idea that people anywhere in the world were ignorant of paternity. It's always seemed to me a kind of ridiculous allegation, a completely nonsensical idea. This seems far more likely than the way you've been talking about. So many women with power in Africa actually needed to be virgins, in the sense that they needed to be quite clear that their power did not come from having sex with a man. It came from a completely different source. And in so many societies of that kind, among other things, along with power, come babies. But babies don't come from having sex with a man. Babies come from the blood and some other place. But I'm wondering, have you any more stories about this whole topic of so-called ignorance of paternity?
Not from African folklore. Matter of fact, this one just stunned me into silence when I first saw it, because I have run into that. I don't remember who it was. It's a book by either Maria Gimbitas or some other major female anthropologist who mentions the idea that it's possible that it was women who, through animal husbandry, observed animals mating and made that connection between sexual activity. But this is the first and only instance that I have encountered in African folklore, and definitely something I'm keeping an eye out for, because like I said, I was just stunned when I read the story. It opened quite a few doors in my mind.
I wanted to ask another question, if I can.
Mhm.
You had this story about this woman who had this ceremony with the fire and the color blue and lost her baby.
Right.
So what I wanted to ask is, first, if there is a place that I can read this story, and second, I have a feeling that something is very strong in the ceremony that she did, and it's like a manipulation to something about the baby dying is like the penalty. Okay, now you should avoid doing that. So I want to hear what you felt when you read it, and if you feel the same way in this way.
Well, first, you can find the story in Mina Salami's Sensuous Knowledge, and I'll share the slides, and they have the references and everything, which by itself is just an amazing, amazing book and brings alive so many other myths and folklore. And she also talks about the development of the indigo dyeing industry on the Western African coast. Going to the story, yes, I was just crushed when I found out that the baby, was taken from her as a penalty. But then the injunction she gets from the spirits at the end is to only teach the secret to women. So I don't know that the baby getting taken away was, punitive in the sense of you shouldn't have this knowledge. It was, I thought about it in the sense of, okay, this is what you have to give up in order to acquire this knowledge, which opens a whole other door of possibility for exploration. So, but I think there is definitely a lot more to that story. It's rich in symbolism in so many ways, from the fire dancing, to the white cloth. There is a lot of symbolism in that story, which I think bears some exploration. But something I always keep in mind as I read these stories is what era in which they were told, and is it possible that this story might have a different, context to it when it was told way, 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 way back in the day, as women transferred this knowledge amongst themselves. Because as it stands now, and in the last couple 100 years, indigo dyeing wasn't so much exclusively a woman's only enterprise. It may have started out that way, but it's definitely not the case. Matter of fact, the famous indigo pits in northern Nigeria seem to have a lot of men working them now, as opposed to it being an almost exclusive woman's thing, as the story implies. But that's what I can say about that story. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, in a way, it's also the idea that you have to pay for the power is I think idea of this exactly. You cannot die and relive. You have it's cutting. And I also think that there is something that is really strong about saving the knowledge. In many of the stories, once you give the knowledge, it's a question that needs to be asked. How do you give knowledge and stay connected and stay in your place, something like that.
Thank you.
Thanks. There's a question from Glenn, who maybe can't speak again, but it's about the idea of stories that might highlight the civilizing role of women in a context of gender that's non-binary or fluid. Do you have any context like that, Helen, that you know of?
None that jump to mind immediately, but I expect to sometime soon, because where the theme for the deep dives now for the Mythological African series is African sexualities. And that's where I'm planning to really get deeper into the notions of gender, because there was a deep understanding that it wasn't so much a binary, and there are culture specific terms to refer to people who are not one way or another. So stay tuned is all I can say for now. Stay tuned, and if I find those stories, I will be sure to highlight them.
It's worth just saying a little bit in context to that question about the way that gender transforms in a many African initiation ritual context, so that women may sometimes act out and go through very masculinized actions or dress, and contrary to that, boys may go through very feminized dress, and they go through this kind of journey before there's a disambiguation in boys and girls particularly. Examples would be like the Dogon cosmology, where all people have twin souls until going through initiation and then kind of differentiated. And there would be many other examples we could get from Bushman people as well, Hadza people as well, where we get that sort of switching of gender. So there's a lot of fluidity and transformation, but that's in a context of ritual rather than.
And of course, don't forget, there's also Ife Amadume's wonderful work on the Igbo, male daughters, female husbands. I mean, there's absolutely no reason to assume in Africa that you have sort of masculine and feminine. That's those two genders, which are, not really nothing to do with indigenous conceptions in so many parts of the world, especially where ritual is concerned. So it's just normal to reverse it. Yeah, a
lot less rigidity in that sort of masculine and feminine. There's much more sort of transform. I was also going to say, in relation to the loss of the child and the sort of punishment idea that Dikla was talking about, that there are many stories and ritual practices that I can think of in relation to rainmaking, and also kingship, and how women are very strongly instrumental in the transmission of kingship. And those women that are critical in like sort of divine kingship marriages are usually not fertile. They are usually, for instance, an example would be Luigi, the Lunda queen, who was perpetually having menstrual cycles. She would never conceive. She was a sterile queen, and she was a kind of looked after women's menstruation and their reproductive problems as a result of that. Also rain-making rituals where children, rain is the children you have born, is indicating that both they're like matrilineages of rain chiefs in the Isanzu peoples of Tanzania, and these chiefs are not supposed to have children because they create the rain, and that is the children that they give for the community. So this idea of a power that you gain may imply losing ordinary fertility, because the power is given to the community as a kind of as a kind of gift of fertility in some way.
Yes, it could be metaphorically, but I was wondering if it would be it might be a hint to tell women this is dangerous, don't go there, because this is, I feel that in the myth there are a lot of hidden places that there are. If you wipe, you can see what the hint was, but the patriarchy or the storyteller in the context when he's telling it and why you need to survive in this environment. So he's hinting you, don't go there. So this is what is interesting me. All kind of messages to women who are hearing the story, reading the story. And this is what I work with.
Any more? Ian, you didn't want to say any more? You weren't, I'm not sure if your hand was up or what. I don't know. Anybody else?
I've just got a quick question to Helen. It's just, it's so good that you just take these stories and kind of convey what they say to you. But I'm wondering whether you've found any use at all in some of these more abstract theoretical approaches to mythology from people like Luc de Hirsch or Claude Lévi-Strauss, who I found quite useful, although, you know, you've got to go a little bit beyond them. But have you found any use of these sort of theoreticians of mythology that have been quite influential in anthropology?
I have, as a matter of fact. So when I first started Mythological Africans, I read this book called Myth in Africa by Isidore Okweho. And I am very glad I did that, because it is through that book that I came to understand just what it is exactly anthropologists do, especially in understanding how anthropologists process myths. And not just that, because this book was written by an African person, he was also very rigorously pointed out the blind spots of the Lévi-Strausses and the different people in how they applied some of the mythical frameworks lifted from European contexts in the African context. And I think I did a very long thread on Mythological Africans about, you know, how to read mythology and folklore, which, you know, summarizes the different approaches. So the structuralist, the diffusionist approaches and all of that, which was really just me processing my thoughts about, you know, what approach to take with these stories. So short answer to your question, yes. But I also especially want to do more study around folklore theories, understanding folklore classifications, mostly because something I'm very interested in doing is understanding the story of African people in the global context, because I think the idea that Africa was the dark continent has created this impression that, you know, there was a time in the history of African peoples where we were just a unit unto ourselves, and we had these pristine stories which only got shaken apart during colonization. And what I'm finding is that's just not true. From the migrations, out of Africa and back into Africa, and just trade routes and everything, there's always been this fertile exchange of stories leaving the African continent, coming into the African continent. So I want to do a bit more study around folklore theories, just to be able to place African stories in their rightful context, without, feeling the need to trace origins so much, just understanding where things stand and what influence might have been working, whether it's historical, political, social, economic, to make a story what it is. So yes, some exposure, which I found very useful, and definitely wanting to learn some more. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Leoncia, do you want to ask Helen a question there?
Sure. Yeah, I was just wondering, I mean, I loved how you start with Adam and Eve, and it's helpful to us on the Western side of stuff to get kind of a handle on stuff. With the project I'm doing, it's like I really get stuck with this idea of civilization, because to me, it represents everything, that we're not, in a way, or like, it was so helpful. Your slides today, you had these subheadings, like medicine, you had agriculture. So you were kind of pinpointing, you were kind of taking apart the idea of civilization, because I think people don't really, we have this idea of civilization, and it's a very patriarchal idea, I guess. I mean, I definitely grew up with it, I'm in my 50s now, and I feel that, and I was wondering what you thought about what we can do about that, because you seem to be a spokesperson now. I mean, it's incredible, those stories that you told today. I wonder if will there be any kind of, not that you should bring them together at all in a way, but like, it was so fascinating, because to me, a lot of these stories, there's such deep themes about separation. And often it's the woman that gets separated, whether she's, what do you call it? The person that isn't married that comes in and destroys a marriage or whatever, or, well, not really that, but, or somehow connected with nature and this whole nature culture divide. And I was just wondering what you thought about this whole term of civilization, because you're coming at it from a really beautiful, you're engaging in a way that's so helpful. We need to be helped along this. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but I was just wondering what you thought about how we get around this term, really, because I'm struggling with this term of civilization, because to me it just means buildings and agriculture, whereas what you divided it up into, the beautiful terms that baking, there was obviously indigo, shea butter, there was numeracy, there's navigation. It was fascinating how you put that together for us tonight. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I appreciate that you saw the connection there too. And I have to say that I was very, very deeply influenced by Dr. Wengro's essay, in how he shifted the focus of the idea of civilization from, buildings and urban structures and political structures and, what to me essentially boils down to power mongering sometimes, to the idea of mutual aid,
yes,
taking care of each other, of social cooperation, civic activism, and hospitality, just human beings humaning in the best possible way, for lack of a better way of putting it.
Humaning,
so,
that's great. That should be a proper verb.
Yeah.
So that really was the influence here. And I think that is what has been lost with women and other marginalized people being pushed out of the story of human civilization. Right. Is that the focus really just goes to the wrong place in my estimation. And how to shift back, keep telling these stories, but also, which is what the folks at RAG and other groups do, keep challenging the idea that human progress can only be defined in certain terms, which in today's world, there's a high focus on technology, high focus on sprawling economies, which
Mm.
are not in and of themselves bad things. It's just there are other things, and more importantly, we should be able to take care of each other. And I think the story of African peoples has a lot to offer here, because at the core of most philosophies coming out of African people is the idea that you are a human being through other human beings. So if you're not able to see humanity from the perspective of others, then you're doing something wrong. So keep sharing these stories, keep sharing the philosophies from indigenous people on the African continent and elsewhere that tell a fuller human story, and keep challenging what needs to be challenged.
I love that. But will you be doing anything with everything that you've collated? Because that must have taken such a lot of work. Can we hope that you're going to bring it together, or what's your plans with that then? Is that another project altogether?
I always have more projects than the time and resources I have would allow me to accomplish.
Because that was quite something. What you brought together today was quite incredible. You have to, I mean, hats off to you. That was amazing. So
well, thank you.
I hope it,
sorry.
Yeah, no, I hope it develops into something, because it's so useful as well from our perspective. It's like it's not that you're bringing it all into one continent, or I think you're dividing it, but you're showing the diversity, which is what we need to, we're so lacking in our understanding. So it's wonderful. Thank you very much. Anyway.
Thank you.
Well, it's getting to 8:15.
Yeah, but Ebony has. Can we have Ebony, and then maybe that's coming to the end. Ebony, can you hear?
Yeah. Hi. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Helen, particularly for a truly engaging and absorbing talk.
Could you switch the camera on?
Okay.
Oh. Maybe difficult.
All right.
Okay.
Oh,
Hi.
thank you.
Thank you.
Hi.
Much better to see you.
Yeah. Thank you. So thank you very much, everybody. And thank you particularly to Helen. I was just going to, it came to me, I've been ruminating over this until Leontia spoke. And she kind of took some words out of my mouth. And this kind of parallels what I would call the different personalities of two big deities in my culture. I'm Nigerian, from the Igbo tribe. So two major players in Igbo mythology would be Amadioha, the god of the skies, who is male, and Allah, the goddess of the earth, who is female. And their personalities kind of illustrate what I think Helen has done in talking about civilizing influence. So if you think about the masculine, fiery, impulsive temperament of Amadioha, in the male, what I would call the wild side of humanity, what the men are doing, chasing each other, hunting down, conquests, technological advancement, all of that stuff. Whereas Allah, that is the grounding force, the civilizing influence, teaches us, pulls us, compels us to rein in those excesses, to put what can potentially be creative or destructive about fire, for instance, and put it to good use and direct them. Civil is when you're gentle, when you're able to try and resolve an argument without resorting to violence and all that. So if we think about it in that way, you can see how the civilizing influence of women and the feminine and the goddesses are able to let us break away from those tendencies that can get destructive and get us to put these into it's only when we do that, when we rein in the wild side, that we can now truly birth civilizations, so to say.
Thank you. Helen, you want to say something?
Well, it's good to see you, Ebony. First of all, I didn't know you were here, so thank you. And yes, that is really a great illustration of what this discussion has been about. You know, are we going to define civilization in terms of big structural accomplishments, you know, philosophical theories, or are we going to define civilization in our ability to work with each other, to look out for each other, to care for each other? So thank you for sharing that story.
Great. Thank you so much, Helen. I think we're going to wind up very shortly. I will say something about next week for people in just a minute. Magic all over again. For everybody to hear all the stories. I hope my connection's not too unstable. Can you hear? Are you all right?
Sometimes, yeah.
You can sometimes hear. Okay. Well, maybe you should say thank you, Chris, because
No, come on.
Yeah.
No, we can hear you.
Okay. So yeah, thank you so much, Helen. You just as Leoncia says, you know, putting all that together is, and as Ebony says, putting it all together in such a way and so thoughtfully and so provocatively for people who are not familiar to the wealth of African traditions, that is so valuable. And we really do hope that it's going to be one of your prime projects to try to bring that together in ways that are so accessible for people all over the world, not only Africa. So thank you again. It's just a pleasure to have you here to speak and teach us about these things so much.
Pleasure is all mine. RAG feels like home, so I'm always glad to come back.
Well, that is
you
wonderful.
feed as much into my work as I share with you all. So thank you. Thank you.
Well, that's wonderful to know and to hear. Certainly it should be your home. And for next week, people, we have something actually that connects a bit to some of the stories Helen's telling about how women's kind of spiritual dimension, it connects with affliction, often in some of these stories. Next week, we have our colleague, Mark Jameson, who's done long years of field work with Miskito people of Nicaragua, the Mosquito Coast in Nicaragua. And indeed, Mark is married into a Miskito kinship system. He's married to a Miskito woman. But he's going to tell us about what is called grisi sickness, which is a form of possession that takes hold of young women amongst the Miskito in tradition. And this is, he believes, an expression of solidarity and resistance among Miskito women, who are generally a matrilocal people and kind of matrilineal people, or matrilateral. So yes, we can maybe make some connections between tonight and the Miskito next week. So please do, whoever can make it, please come along and listen to RAG next week, next Tuesday, with Mark Jameson. But thank you so much, Helen. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Marvelous. Okay. Goodbye, everybody, then.
Thank you, Helen. Bye-bye.
Very cool.